DOC,
Genesis Winkler.
DOC,
Genesis Winkler.
DOC, allow me to reintroduce myself. DOC,
Genesis Winkler.
DOC,
Genesis Winkler.
DOC, allow me to reintroduce myself. My name, allow me to
Greetings. My name is Dr. Dennis Winkler, also known as the psychosocial clinician. I want to just say one of the things that I find most challenging is actually sharing about myself. But I'll try to do my best today. To start off by saying I am a son, I am a husband, I am a father. I'm also a clinician, psychotherapist. I have a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling and a Ph.D. in counselor education and supervision. I'm a community servant. I've been a community servant for years. You know, I'm a brother who hails from Baltimore City, still live in Baltimore City, trying to do my best to uplift Baltimore City and just the black world. You understand what I'm saying? And by extension, just humanity. So some of the things that I do, I'm also an entrepreneur. I've been an entrepreneur for quite a bit of time. I've been an entrepreneur since I was a teenager. Owned several businesses. My first business was a landscaping business where I actually hired my cousin, also sold candy and school and all types of things, you know. Actually, I couldn't sell drugs. I couldn't sell drugs. You know, my friends and them, they sold drugs and all this type of things. This might seem weird, but nonetheless, they sold drugs. I couldn't sell drugs, but I wanted some things, and I also wanted some money. So I tapped into an entrepreneurial aspect early on. From there, I've opened many businesses, had a communications business, hired many people, installing different types of satellite dishes, communications, and things like that. Also owned a truck rental business. I've also owned and operated also a real estate investment company where I've not only invested in real estate, but I've also taught people how to do that as well. And these are things I've done in my 20s, you know, early 20s. So I like to say that I've had a plethora of experiences early on, business, money-making opportunities and things of that nature. But to be honest with you, nothing really touched me more than really giving back to my community. So I've done all of that in my early 20s, and somewhere along the line, I wanted to give back, you know, in my early 20s, in my mid 20s, in my 25 to 28, 29, 30, I wanted to do more. I wanted to help other people. I always wanted to help people do better, especially those in my hometown, because I see so much talent often overlooked. Often Baltimore is looked at as a place of people that are just desolate and destitute and, you know, all that type of thing. But one thing about Baltimore, if I can be honest with you, is that there's a lot of entrepreneurship here. There's a lot of black people doing their best in surviving, and I'm going to say even to some degree thriving. The picture that you see on things like The Wire and all that, that's not, I mean, yeah, we got some of that, but we got more than that. We have more than that. We have more than that picture of us, that picture of us as being drug dealers and all this and all that. And, you know, that's real. My last name is Winkler. My father's government name is Dennis Winkler. My mother's name is Karen Angela Winkler. She used to be a Johnson. My father's from Virginia. My mother's from Baltimore. They met up in Virginia because my mother moved down there after her father had passed. But nonetheless, I like to think that I inherited some great attributes from my family, my mother, my father. And I grew up in a household that was, my father was an African-centered type of person, you know, read a lot of books, did things like that. Took me to lots of cultural events here in Baltimore, DC, different places. He took us to museums. He took us to a lot of different places, you know. And I think that has impacted me in a way. I grew up in a household, my mother and my father, I believe I've received some of the best attributes, I would say, if I had to keep it real, of both my mother and my father. My mother, I'm going to say, is a natural intellect. You know, my mother didn't even graduate from high school, but I mean, she's one of the sharpest people I know. You mean, you know, she can do better than math than I can today after, you know, even having a Ph.D., you know, I have to go through many classes, statistics and all that type of thing. But, and then just not the math, she's just a natural intellect, which very witty person. My father's a very curious, outgoing person who sets his mind to things, and whatever he sets his mind to, he will carry out. Well, he's done a lot of things, but right now he teaches Tai Chi, martial arts. He does a lot of healing practices. He does a lot in the community, but he always has come from this African-centered perspective. My mother, I'm just telling you, like, my father has this academic type of thing where he read books and all these type of things, expose us to different scholars like Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and Dr. Naeem Akbar and even Dr. Ray Hagins and different people that was really instrumental in my development growing up here in Baltimore. My mother, on the other hand, she was a nurturer, she was a carer. She taught me how to share. She taught my siblings and I how to love one another, how to really just not be stingy and all these different types of things. But in my household even, it was a safe haven in a community that I grew up in. We would call it in Baltimore, from the streets, Old York and Cater, OYC, you know, which was a pretty tough neighborhood. I mean, I think maybe putting pretty in there was an understatement, but it was a tough neighborhood growing up in the 90s, early 90s. Well, I stayed in that neighborhood until about 96, 97. But before then, I lived in the county, Anne Arundel County, for like a year or so. My father, just to be frank, my father wanted to move us back in the black community because of some issues out there in Anne Arundel County. So coming back to the city, it was different for me, and many might not even realize that. And I came back to the city in about the first grade, and after being in the county schools out there in Anne Arundel County, many might not realize this. When I came back to the city, the students were a little ahead of me, you know, and I had to catch up with reading and all these type of things. I came to the class, the students were vibrant, hugging the teachers, and the classes were smaller, but it was just, the teachers was hugging, and I wasn't used to this because my teachers were European in my kindergarten class. But when I came back to the city, the teacher named Miss Gregory, she was hugging and just, I think she may even kissed us, you know, and I was like, what? It took me some getting used to, and she kind of like, oh, give me a hug or give me a kiss or whatever, right? But nonetheless, she was stern and she also cared. Going back to my mother and my father, but my mother more so that love, that caring, she showed not just us, she showed the community. And let me back it up, our extended family. Our house was a safe haven for those who could use some assistance, from family members to even people in the communities. In the community, I'm being literal. There's people that my mother and father took in our home when maybe their mothers weren't doing so good or their fathers weren't doing so good. I'm talking about people who just lived in our communities, no blood relation at all. So we really, I come from a family of helpers. You know, I'm in the helping field now professionally, but I've always been around an atmosphere that is not just familial, but communal, and that which helped people and aided people. And those who are maybe struggling with some of the most difficulties, from addiction to all types of things. And it was a healthy household. It was a healthy household. My community back in the 90s, again, I said it, that we called the Old York and Cater. I lived on a street called Willsby. But during that time in the 90s, lots of times your community was, at least from us, the black community in Baltimore, your neighborhood was represented by streets. And typically it'd be the two toughest streets. or the street, or a few toughest streets in that neighborhood, or what some would call the strip, or some might call where the trap house is, or where the trap houses. But back in Baltimore in those days, it was a open, what do they call it? An open, fair drug market type of thing. I mean, in my neighborhood on Old York Road, which we call up top, there was so much crack. You know, and I'm saying this is, I know we talk about 79 and 80, but this is in the 90s. Crack was rampant. I mean, and I saw so much trauma. I saw young men trying to make a living selling crack. I saw some people's mothers strung out on this stuff. I even saw vows on the street as we played. Now, not only was drugs rampant, the violence was rampant. So this neighborhood, which we called OYC, and one time they used to just call it Cater. But then at some point in Baltimore, it became very popular to have these acronyms. So we called ourselves OYC, you know. And other neighborhoods such as McCabe, I don't think McCabe had an acronym, but mostly other neighborhoods had acronyms. Like, let me just give an example. Like they would say CBS, and that's in West Baltimore, and that would be Calhoun, Baker, and Stricker. I believe that's what it would be called. But nonetheless, growing up in this neighborhood, Old York and Cater, was very popular to some degree because there was a very popular rivalry between Old York and Cater and McCabe, which McCabe is one street in another neighborhood that was not that far from our neighborhood. But how we differed in Baltimore than like the West Coast and maybe some other cities is that if you lived in a neighborhood, you almost by proxy, or by default belong to a gang in a sense, because this is where you lived. And you know, there was some, I guess I could say, some pros and some cons to that. You know, people would, if you just lived in a neighborhood and people found you from another neighborhood that they had some competition with or some beef with, you may have to deal with something. So lots of times we traveled together back then. So this neighborhood, McCabe in Old York, there was a rivalry that you can Google even, you know. Back in those days, there was a lot of drive-by shootings. And back in those days, that's when Uzis were popular. That's before, you know, people having these choppers and Tech 9s and all those things. When I got a little older, Tech 9s and all that became popular. But Uzis and just, I guess people call pistols and handguns and all that, just coming down the street, just blasting each other. That's some of the dark sides of the neighborhood. But there was also some very uplifting things in the neighborhood. To be honest, even though then people said community wasn't as strong, I would still say living in that neighborhood and even moving to a more middle class, a more upper working class, if I can say, middle class neighborhood. After that, the people were tighter. The people worked together. The people talked. They communicated. So that was one of the benefits. In fact, living in that neighborhood, to some degree, no one ever came in my house and took anything. We used to even leave our front door open, and it was dangerous. It was tough, but nonetheless, my mother also had a good relationship with the young men out there doing that thing. So we really never had any problems, you know. And one of the things I appreciate about really living in that neighborhood, because my father worked, you know, he made pretty good money even. You know, he worked at a place called Westinghouse. I forgot, it was technology or electronics, and that's one of those jobs back in the day where you did really well. I don't care if you was mopping the floor or you had some type of professional position. And we were okay financially, you know. I think the only reason why we lived in that community is because there was some issues with black people at that time really being able to get loans from banks and things like that, especially around credit. But nonetheless, I really appreciate that experience, because I don't think if I did not grow up in that neighborhood that I would be able to truly be able to empathize with people. Now, that's just something I think, I'm not sure, but I can empathize because those brothers out there that were selling drugs ultimately were my friends. When I was younger, none of us really had, I'm not going to say none of us, lots of us never really had ambition to really sell drugs. We actually looked at drug dealers to some degree as bad guys, but also looked at drug dealers as some type, maybe idealized them to some degree because they had nice cars and 300ZXs and Acras and Infinities at some point, and Lexuses and Benzes before, Lexuses and Acras and all those things came out, but Benzes and BMWs or Beamers and all that type of thing, right? So we kind of looked at them both ways. In school, I went to Guilford Elementary School, which was a neighborhood school, a community school, a zone school, where they had officer-friendly program, and it's around the time when Reagan and I guess the Reagans had this "Say No to Drug" campaign, or the war against drugs and all that type of thing, and so we learned that drugs was a bad thing. We learned those type of things, although we went back home every day, and many of us faced parents who were really addicted to some heavy drugs. I will say that my family, my parents were not necessarily doing heavy drugs, anything like that. But I will say that I do have family members and community members who even my parents aided, who really lived even in proximity, or they took them in. They weren't really being judgmental. Even uncles, like really alcohol. We don't talk a lot about alcohol, but alcohol was really a major issue in my family. I think I would call it a hard drug, especially if you're addicted. I've seen lots of things like that. Again, I was able to tap in because I lived it. My friends, again, never had aspirations to be drug dealers. But at some point in my life, I started to realize that two things. One, that most of my friends who didn't sell drugs, most of them began to sell drugs. Most of them began to be on the corner for someone even. And even when I was younger, there used to be this thing about breeding people to sell drugs in the community. Even they used to have this thing called, they used to look out, like, look, we're gonna breed him. But not only breed him because they felt like he had the proper temperament to sell drugs, then it became this thing called sonning him. He's my son, that's my son, that's my man. Young men wanted nice things lots of times. And the second thing I was going to say is that many times as I looked around, I began to realize that I was one of the few people who had a mother at home. My mother typically stayed at home. She was a stay-at-home mom for the most part of my life. And my father worked. But I realized that I had a mother and a father together, and a father who worked and a stay-at-home mom. And most of my friends either had a mother, in most cases. I'm looking at this during those times. This is not in hindsight. This is at some point, I just realized this, that at some point, and their mothers had to work. And let's keep that clear. That most of the mothers are out trying to work and make a way. There's others who took drugs, but Even some of those who took drugs, they even were still trying to make a way. Another thing is, sometimes there was a single father, and the single father would be at work and trying to make a way, and then that leaves all types of time and opportunity for children my age to get into some things. And when you're looking at things, especially from a materialistic standpoint, drugs become very, very enticing, selling drugs. Because not only did it allow for you to get material things, it also gave you some clout. It also was, it gave you a little popularity, respect. In a sense, during those days, you felt like you were a grown man. Now, again, I didn't sell drugs. The reality is, but most of the people around me did. I never even smoked weed, but most of the people around me did. Most of the people, I never even drank, but most people did. I was around, they tried to say, yo, Manny, that's my nickname, Manny, It used to be funny, some of them used to call me Manny Ill, but nonetheless, they attempted to give me the things, but I really looked at the conditions of the community. This is way back. I looked at the conditions of even my family members strung out on alcohol and other things. And I knew that I did not want that for myself. But I also say, pairing that with that African-centered upbringing, pairing that with a mother and a father at home who really as one of my good friends, brother Kevin, says, my parental pressure was stronger than my peer pressure. And I realized that I couldn't do those things. So I found other ways to make money, creative ways. Again, I was talking about starting a lawn care business, landscaping. I call it a landscaping business because I didn't just cut grass. And I was probably in middle school. I just didn't cut grass. I used to cut trees and put mulch, and I used to do flower beds, and I used to edge people's lawns. Even though I didn't have a weed whacker or an edger, I used to use an axe. Yes, an axe to edge it, to get that crisp, sharp edge. I used to have a pager back then, or we used to call it a beeper or a pager if you want to feel a little bit more fancy or something. You just say pager. But, and my customers used to hit me up. I mean, I'm going to tell you, so even listening to hip hop, having a pager, back in those days, you kind of felt like you was something. You had a pager. Not only did I have a pager for people to hit me up, my friends and all of them, I had a pager with my clients, my customers really hit me up to do their yard work, And I learned that from my mother. My mother used to have me doing her work. I learned it from my father and his friend who also, who opened up a landscaping business. And I also learned my skills from going to Virginia, where my families lived. My Aunt Sharon, my cousin Rocky, Squirty, and Boo, and Uncle Larry, where we used to cut the field. I mean, they had land at their home, riding lawnmowers, and we used to go up to the church and we used to cut the church's lawn. So that was some pieces that sparked this entrepreneurial aspect of me, especially my uncle, because my uncle in Virginia, who was my aunt's husband, Uncle Larry, we used to get paid for doing the lawn care, which I first got those skills at. First, with a push lawnmower and also a riding lawnmower. And then we also got paid for cleaning the bathrooms at the church. So money, my little business thing kind of was being sparked, or I guess the seeds were being planted. Additionally, after that, again, my mother did things in her yard, and my father had the lawn care business for about a year. I took that and said, I'm going to make some money. After that, that was middle school. I started selling candy. Quite a few people used to go sell candy, but it's I couldn't sell dope or none of that type of thing. So I really perfected it. And I really used to take the money, go to the penny candy store. Used to be a little black penny candy store. They opened up and closed. They had the chews, the straws, and all these different things. And then and even some of the blow pops in the regular little Chinese joints. Just buy those, and then you sell them higher in school because children. I never sold no dope, but candy is like dope to children when they're in school. So I used to sell the candy, and I used to sell the candy. Like, yo, Dennis, yo, Manny. I did that. Middle school, cut grass. So you couldn't cut grass all season, so you had to pick up another hustle during the cold months. But also, I used to do raking and all that type of thing. But moving forward, I got to high school, and I had two big. Again, I told you that I hired my cousin, who now his name is Marcus Miller, he's a very popular makeup artist right now. Check him out. He's real popular in the makeup game. But nonetheless, I bought these big book bags from. They weren't even book bags. They Eddie Bauer back in the day. I used to wear Eddie Bauer back in the day when I was younger, which was a little different. I was a good dresser. I'm not gonna lie. I was fresh. I actually won best dress in high school. But nonetheless, these big old, they were coolers, but they were like backpacks. And we used to fill them up with sodas and chips and all types of things to keep them cool, And I filled up a backpack for him, filled up the backpack for me. And I used to jam off in school. I used to jam off in school. You make a pretty good dollar. I talked a little bit about my neighborhood and growing up in a household. But and growing up in Baltimore, one thing I really, really want to touch on, though, and people may not know this, especially those who don't live in Baltimore, is that people from Baltimore are proud. We're like very proud people, And I think to some degree, we need to archive some of our culture. One of the things in the neighborhood I grew up in is the same neighborhood that Tupac Shakur lived in and grew up in when he was here in Baltimore. Back in the day when they had block parties and, there was hip hop, right? There was hip hop. We listened to hip hop. But there was also, Baltimore has its own sound, which and the sound of Baltimore would be Baltimore club music. Back in those days, I can't even remember all the DJs, DJ Booby, DJ Scotty B, DJ, well, you gotta say, brother, what's the DJ up in Mike Crosby? What's the one who's Doodoo Brown? And even, to be honest with you, I think we might have been little trendsetters. I know the LGBTQ community is, haven't had a voice in places, but we had somebody called Miss Tony, which was very respected in Baltimore. Brother, sometimes we call him, one time it was called Miss Tony. Excuse me, this is what people used to call him. It was, I guess, a sign of endearment back then. Some people call him Miss Tony, Faggy Tony, and then he called himself Big Tony, But nonetheless, he was like a club scene phenomenon. Then you had Frank Ski, that's what I'm looking for, Frank Ski, Doodoo Brown, But nonetheless, I'm just saying there is a beat of Baltimore, you know what I mean? And that club music was intricately tied to the streets for good, not so good, and maybe the bad. In the club music, there used to be representation of where you from, what hood you repping. You understand? It's like songs like they just used to call out the names of the neighborhoods that I was speaking about a little earlier. Like we used to be like, oh York, woo, oh York, and you be in the club just, oh York, woo, oh York, and then it just was, the culture was rich. It was fast, and these are young people in the club. They used to have songs like out my way, I'm gonna say the word, but I don't know if we cut it out or not. Out my way, bitch! Ah, can't you see me? I'm trying to get through. Just different things, which was really, it was a lot of aggression. But also there was a sense of something built. But these are young people, and sometimes fights came about as a result of that. They used to have, watch out for the big girl, just different things, or just songs like just the sounds and just dancing and all that type of culture. Some people used to, from my cousins from down south would be like, y'all dance? Yeah, dancing in Baltimore has always been a thing. Dancing and dirt bikes. I'm gonna call those the double D's, right? But it was the club music that I think that has dwindled to some degree. And dirt bikes, and sadly enough, that drug culture. But again, I'm saying this, that there was a negative aspect of it, but there's also some positive to it. Even hip hop, the negative and the positive. As I was stating, I took the negative, or not just the negative, I took the message of these type of songs, from hip hop to club music, and use it as a vessel or means to energize myself to accomplish things. That grit, that aggression. Although I'm not a very aggressive person, or maybe some people probably would say a little. I don't think I've never been that aggressive, but I've been assertive, if that makes sense. I've always been respectful, but I also demanded respect as well. So going into high school with, when I was going to high school, it was a nice time. It was a great time. It was a great time to be going to high school. I remember the music, Biggie Smalls, and Bones Thugs and Harmony was out. And man, it was a great time. So I sold candy and sold stuff in school, got best dressed, was homecoming king. My grades were okay. My grades were mediocre. I'm going to say, I'm going to say my grades for the most part were just regular, mediocre, average, for the most part. Average to really good. I would probably go back and forth, but I always been like a good child, a good friend, a good brother. Never crossed nobody, none of those type of things. I would say I wasn't like no tough guy, you know what I'm saying, but I wasn't a slouch. In middle school I had a time where about a year or so where people tried to test me. I had curly hair. I'm gonna just keep it 100. I had curly hair. People used to kind of like hate on me. I used to dress really nice, Once I slow down a little bit, again, I'm gonna dress really nice again. That's what I said. But nonetheless, I could dress really nice. So there was some haters out there. And, some people used to call me Pretty Ricky. And then it got to the point where, they used to call, he's a faggy or something like that, That happened about a year or so. I got in a fight with a dude, good brother now, I guess. I pulled a seat from underneath him, though, after a while and let him fall on the floor. He's a big guy. I didn't know big people were so strong when I fought him, though. He was really strong. He's like a big guy. He was very funny. His name was Clarence. He was a real funny brother. He used to try to tease me and stuff. But overall, I never really been the guy that really was a teased guy or a bullied guy. And if somebody did try it, I would, do things like that or fight, But I could always fight. I was into martial arts. I can't say I won every fight, but I probably won most. Or at least got, it was probably we were going head to head. I had a little aggression. I will say that I did have a little piece in me that if you cross the line, I probably would do something. You know what I mean? If I had to be real, keep it really real, and many people probably don't even know this. And I think this is important to tell. I could easily have been a statistic. I could have been. You know, I never thought about really becoming a drug dealer. I just knew my parents couldn't do it. But I can't lie and say that I never thought, well, maybe I could invest my money. I never did. But I worked. I worked at Popeyes when I had my businesses. I worked at the Sheraton when I was in high school, also doing the business, with the candy and all that. I always worked. I used to come around, when I used to come around the block, go to the corner stores, dudes be like, yo, man, hey, yo, Dennis, yo, man, hey, Dennis, yo, the dudes on the corner asking me for money. I'm like, ain't you out here selling drugs? They like, nah, I just bought some sneakers. I just bought some tennis. And it just depends on what time. People might say tennis. Some people might say sneakers. You know what I mean? So, they used to get their money, they used to spend it quickly. And sometimes when I learned, they was getting beat. A lot of the young brothers was getting beat by the people they were selling for. Sometimes they got, they wasn't making as much money as people thought, but it did come with some recognition. It came with, I'm tough. Or it almost came with some level of protection, because back in those days, people used to be under somebody. So they had they had the levels of selling drugs, And even in my neighborhood, they had different cliques of drug dealers, Like the neighborhood came together as one, but they had like different brothers selling drugs over here for this dude, brothers over here selling drugs for, and maybe some sisters was all mixed up in there and all that type of thing. And sometimes they beefed inside of the neighborhood, but came together as a united front when they came against other areas. I will say I got a lot of pride, and I'm not saying I'm prideful, like, egotistical type of guy, but I am really proud of much of what black people have done across the world in regards and respect to the oppression that we experience. A lot of the symptoms that you see, such as selling drugs, buying drugs, and all these type of things, these are symptoms. And tapping back into what I was saying earlier, but I appreciate that experience because, again, it allowed me to realize these are human beings. I realize they're human beings because they're my brothers, they're my sisters, they're my friends who ended up selling drugs, even ended up some killing each other, or being killed. I have memories of people who aren't here anymore, many memories. Even where I lived at, they used to have a little park, and they put plaques up of many people who got killed on that street called Old York Road, because many people died there, young brothers, souls who were doing their best in that situation. There's many people who really can't tap into that human aspect of brothers and sisters who come from those environments. But once you live there, it's not that difficult because you get to experience it. Once you live there, you get to experience it. You know that these are human beings because they're your brothers and sisters. And you also know that mean mug is not on all day. And you realize that mean mug is more of a protective factor than it is that these people are just always like that. Back in those days when I was growing up, people wore baggy clothes and they used to walk with their hand, what they call their dip. If you ain't have a gun or not, you used to walk around, they used to have their hand, where they used to have their hand at. And you had to really imagine whether or not there was something in there. So people did a lot of things back then, which I think really was more of a protective factor. You still see it in the streets nowadays where you might get a mean mug. My cousin, Marcus, he came to live with us. I never had a brother, I had all sisters. Miki, Mahisha, I'm gonna just say the nicknames, Miki, Girly, Poonie. Miki is Tamika, Mahisha is Girly, and Poonie is Latanya. I never had a brother growing up, but I had 3 sisters. Some people say today that, that helped me with empathy and those type of skills. I had a lot of family in my house, as I shared. But my cousin Marcus came to live with us probably when I was about I would say 7th, 8th. Well, he came and we started spending a lot more time in the 7th and 8th grade. And Marcus has always been high energy, real funny. And with all that, you know, he was also a handsome brother, and I would say that he aided in a lot of my development as a young man. Him coming over, us hanging out, going out. He was like a ball of energy. So just being around him, by proxy, you're gonna have some popularity, right? At some point, he was just coming over on the weekends, and we formed this great bond. You know, we were cousins, but then we became brothers. We would do all types of stuff. Go downtown, ride bikes, do everything. You know, go to clubs, just do everything together. Go skating, scouting, looking at young ladies and all types of things. But at some point, he stayed, and we went to high school, and he used to be up in my middle school, but he was supposed to be at his high school, but he used to be up there every day at Roland Park. In fact, I got, at Roland Park, backing up a little bit, at Roland Park, I got stabbed on the bus. Yeah, I got stabbed by somebody who was hating on me. I'll be honest with you. I don't even like using those terms, and I guess I get it to a certain degree. It was a young lady, and she wanted someone to deal with me for whatever reason. Again, I said, deal with me. I used to be fresh. That's the only thing I think she looked at me like, oh, who you think you are? And nonetheless, she tried to get somebody to bank me, as we say in Baltimore. Bank me means jump you in other places. And at some point, that did take place. Now, the interesting thing is, being in the neighborhood, my neighborhood returned the favor. I wasn't even really aligned like that, to be honest with you, but in some degree, you're aligned by default, as I said. But also, nonetheless, this young lady and another young lady tried to jump me or bank me on the bus, and they stabbed me. It wasn't like a real deep stab or nothing like that. It was like she pulled out a butterfly knife and she stabbed, like a little cut on my arm or what have you. But it was a lot of rivalries back then. My cousin Marcus was dead. They broke up the buses used to be wild back then. They kind of broke the doors open and got me off the bus, and a lot of things like that happened. Then it was like a little rivalry, a little feud going on, stuff like that. That's just something that happened. I really don't even remember that much, but that's just a part of my story. And I remember that because I'm speaking about Marcus, my cousin, and ultimately he transferred to Northern High School, where I went. Northern High School. Northern High School was the neighborhood school in Baltimore. If you look it up, you'll see. When I say neighborhood, that was my neighborhood school, my zone school. It was a really popular school as pertains to being not a good school. They had good schools like City and Poly and Mervo and all these other schools that you would go to, what they call citywide schools back then. You had to take a test or have a certain GPA or something to get in those type of schools. I went to Northern, which also was my neighborhood zone school again. What we were popular for, they used to call Northern Get High. And they used to say, it used to be a song that they used to kind of mimic a little bit. They used to say, Northern Get High, high, high. It used to be a club song, and they used to just fill those words in with the song. Northern Get High, high, high. And, but Northern also had some great people. They also had a citywide program that is not as popular, and it was a STEM-based citywide program, but once I got there, it was a lot of great people. Again, I had my little businesses going and all that type of thing. My cousin Marcus was instrumental. Again, I got into the fashion show, and that was a game changer for me to some degree. I met my wife in 9th grade at Northern, who I'm still with. Yeah, I met my wife. She's my girlfriend. when I was 16 there. This is during the same time. Rumps in the bump. You know, Bug Thrones and Harmony, and you know, Biggie Smalls, and I mean, it was just a phenomenal time for me, to be honest with you. High school, homecoming, people used to pop lock and dance, but it was a different type of pop lock, and it wasn't our father's pop lock. It was more like they used to do like Mortal Kombat and all types of different types of things, you know. I recall a brother named Needham, who could dance his tail off back then. You know, he could. I don't know if you look at this, he can tell me if he can still dance like that. And he used to be like, we used to feel so good because he was part of our neighborhood, and when he danced, he represented us. You know, and so it was just a beautiful time. Again, met my wife, my cousin, just having a beautiful time. Now, a developmental milestone for me was really being in the fashion shows. And I guess up to this point, I haven't mentioned that I've always been kind of shy. And being in a fashion show was a little different for me, you know, because even though I got on the stage, I was still shy. My grades, I would say I was mediocre or what have you, as it pertains to grades, that type of thing. In high school, I was one of those people that got along with just about everybody. You know, my wife's from Jamaica, or at that time she was my girlfriend. I met her in the 9th grade. They had the ESOL, I would call the ESOL clique, English second language. I don't know, I can't recall exactly what it means. But I hung with them. I hung with those in the side of the cafeteria who were deemed the cool children. I would hang with them. I would hang with those who were a little eclectic, like the band members. I would hang with them. I was pretty much a person who just kind of went along and kind of like just meshed in with like almost anybody. Had fun with them, messed with them, teased them a little bit, but not like really like bad teasing, but kind of like just having fun teasing. And same way on the buses in Baltimore. If you got on the MTA, the cool children went to the back of the bus. You know, if you think about it, we did a lot of fighting to get to the front of the bus, but the cool children went to the back of the bus. What I mean by fighting to get to the front of the bus, I'm talking about our ancestors, you know. But you know, sometimes that back of the bus had a lot of stuff going on. I used to be all over the bus. You know, I used to be from the front of the bus to the back of the bus. I used to just be all over that bus. I did not necessarily get pigeonholed to certain friend groups, who's cool, who's not cool, all this type of thing. I wasn't really a person to tease people. I wasn't with any of that ever, really. I can't say I never tease anybody, but I'm saying to the level where you're bullying that person, no, I didn't do that. I wasn't about that. I like to help people feel good about themselves. And to some degree, I feel like in some degree my popularity or my whatever, I use that in a good way, you know, to help people say, you know, he can be my friend. I even do that now, you know, with some people think that people who have Ph.D.s and all these type of things are special people. I won't take anything away from them. They've done their work. But some people think that people with these type of accolades breathe special air. And I try to demystify that and show people that we all are special. And I've been doing that for a long time when I reflect on it. You know, I've been doing that for a long time. And that's really important to me, to help people feel special, help people feel included, help people challenge those false self-doubts that we pick up on in this country, you know? Because it's a materialistic type of culture. And, you know, I could go all the way back from elementary school all the way on up. There has been being materialistic or material was very important for us growing up, all the way from our sneakers to our clothes to the, even in high school, what type of car you drove. People driving, how you say, well, people go to some of these prominent schools and their parents buy them Benzes and Lexuses and things of that nature. In my school, some people's parents did that, but the youth also did that for themselves. Some of them, they had their own occupation that allowed them to purchase those type of cars and be in high school. One of the most memorable things about high school is the fashion show. I was shy, and I'm still shy. People don't really believe that, but I'm still shy. And what the fashion show did for me was allow me to go out on the stage before I'm going to say hundreds of people, and really, I guess in a sense I'll say, strut, perform, have fun. And I just have to be honest, the fashion show, being in the fashion show did something for me. One, it did allow me to become very popular, because I would always do something a little extra with my clothes, get them made, all types of things. I would just do a little extra. I hate to show you some of those pictures nowadays, boy, y'all would really get on me. But it was a beautiful time. My mother was surprised at some of the things I did in the fashion show. During the time of the fashion shows when Drew Hill was out, and I got this. We had like this bedtime scene, and the song Cisco had out was was it Sleeping in My Bed? And we had a bedtime scene. And Dalmatians were out really popular at that time. So what I did was I went and got a Dalmatian robe made, a Dalmatian pants to go with that robe, and then I got a Dalmatian dog, a stuffed animal, and I coordinated walking down on the catwalk, and I did something where my wife said I hurt my back, but I did a little move, right? I did a little move, and then I threw the dog out in the audience, and all of the young ladies, they all went wild and everything. But nonetheless, and after those months of fashion show, after the fashion show, each year, it's talked about for the remainder of the school year. And that's probably in the springtime, all the way to the end of the spring, early summer. Yeah, that was beautiful. It was a beautiful time, and I think it built a level of esteem in me. But not only did that build esteem in me, those businesses that I spoke about built esteem in me, because it wasn't just the recognition of being in those fashion shows. It was a coordinated idea of things that had to happen. You had to visualize what you were going to do. You had to spend all types of times picking out clothes and thinking about ideas, and then see these things come to fruition, and then allow these things to manifest, and carry these things out was really pivotal to, I guess I would say, my resume. So my high school years were really nice. I had a lot of great time. High school was rough, though. I've seen some people lose their lives, even in my school. There was sometimes people would get shot, and they would shoot in the hallway. I'm not sure if anybody got shot in the hallway, but guns would go off. In my school, they would light the bathrooms on fire nearly every day at some point. They would call in bomb threats. They would lock lockers on fire, smoking weed in the bathrooms. We would be out on the field at some point, probably my 11th and 12th grade year, in front of the school due to some fire, rather than being in class. One brother from around my neighborhood, he got killed in front of the school, which created a whole different atmosphere. Because my neighborhood up at that school was looked at as the tough school, as the neighborhood. In fact, you might have called that Old York High, because they ran that school. And being a part of that neighborhood to a great degree allowed you some sense of safety. One interesting point that I like to bring up is I had a friend from elementary school who lived in that other neighborhood called that was known as McCabe. And this brother, I still saw him as my friend when we got to high school. But because he lived in that other neighborhood, and he lived in another neighborhood when we were younger, but I guess he got a pass when we were in elementary school. But when we got to high school, that neighborhood McCabe, they didn't really last. They had to always transfer because it was, I guess, more people from our neighborhood than their neighborhood. So they ultimately had to go somewhere else, although that was their zone school. So there's ups and downs and many lessons that I've learned throughout life. I see some of these, what people call negatives, as positives. Again, like the hip hop. I took the drive that you hear about people maybe talking about selling crack or chopping up coke and doing all this type of thing. And I just took that same drive and put it into more legal business ventures. So my last year of high school was a little rough. It was rough because there was a little beef between me and somebody. And there was a little beef between me and somebody. And at that point I just wanted to live, you know. And something sparked in me that's like, I want to live. And I never wanted to die, but I realized at that point that there was a great threat out here for black men. And there was a beef. I wanted to live. So nonetheless, some of my friends would take care of that beef. They didn't do anything, but you know, there was some words exchanged and things of that nature. Like, you know, he good type of thing. But again, I wanted to live. I saw people being killed, murdered, those type of things. I prayed to graduate. I think I even got more focused for whatever reason. I really got focused. And then after I graduated from high school, I enrolled for college. I went to Baltimore City Community College. Straight after high school, went to Baltimore City Community College. I was actually in a program, it was called Morgan Connect. So it was connected with Morgan State University. I never actually went to Morgan State University, that was the goal, but I had a Morgan ID and all these type of things, but I was just taking my classes to fulfill some, some prerequisites at Baltimore City Community College. When I got to Baltimore City Community College, learning had taken on, and it was something different. I became more interested in education. To some degree, I look back and I think that our schools really, at some point, really didn't prepare us that well. I still think schools don't always prepare us well. There was something different about that college level that really sparked the interest in me. Even the way they taught us how to write. Many years I thought I couldn't write. I just thought I couldn't write. I thought English was my bad subject, math was my good subject. Then I learned that I can write and I can speak if I want to, right? I wrote this paper for English 101, and it spoke to my experiences in high school, much of what I'm sharing now, and the deaths and how I was just happy to really make it out of there. I guess I did such a good job, my professor asked me if she could publish it somewhere on a board in the school. I wish I had that paper still today. I don't. But I did. At that point, I really wanted to live. And again, if I can back up just a little, I think I started to touch on it, but I could see myself as have easily been what they call a statistic. I even remember having a little beef in my wife's neighborhood when I was in high school. I'm gonna go back and bring it back. And one of the dudes around there, kind of like, I had a car at this point, and one of the dudes around there, he was the neighborhood, I guess, big boy. They used to call it back in the day. And he had the big boy Lex, you know what I mean, or the big body Lex. And somehow I was driving up the street, and he came up next to me with his Lex. I had a little Mitsubishi Eclipse then when I was in the 12th grade. And he looked over at me, and I looked back at him, and somehow he rolled his window down and said, yo, something like, son, why you look at me like that? And I said something to him. I can't remember what I said to him. But in my mind, I said, okay, let him follow me around my neighborhood. And this is why I'm saying that it's so easy for us to go the wrong route. So my intent was, if he come around my neighborhood, because they lived in a little bit more of a, it wasn't as rough as my neighborhood was. And so I wanted him to follow me. He did follow me for some time, but he didn't follow me the entire way. And I'm just going to share this, and this is the part where I meant this. This is where I wanted to go, where I said people may not know this story, maybe not even my parents. So I get to my neighborhood, and I talk to a few of my elder brothers in the community. They're not that much older. They're like probably in their early 20s. And they out in the, they do their thing on and off the block type of thing. Good people though. I tell them about the brother, and they say, for real? Then they say, oh, what he drive? Oh, he the big boy? Oh, all right, so let's go up there and talk to him. But they putting on gloves and talking about gunpowder. Look, I'm not into any of this thing. But at that point, I'm like, I guess this is what we gotta do. Cause dude is pushing up on me, and in Baltimore back then, once it start, it's on and popping. I guess it's still the same way today. And I'm saying that they actually got in my car with gloves to drive up there and talk to homie. I'm glad we didn't find him. I don't know what could have happened. But they say, let's go up there and take care of this. I think they probably would have just talked to him, or I don't know if they would have robbed him, or anything else could have happened. But it didn't happen. But nonetheless, I stopped by, and I was another dude who went to school with me, and I was like, yo, such and such. I was like, you know what you call them at? Because I knew their names. Some of the names I still know, I just won't put their names in this film. And he was like, nah, I don't know where they at. I was like, okay. So I get back to school. I'm the homecoming king, I think, at this time. And dudes roll up, the one that we were looking for, roll up to the school, and he says, and I'm having fun at the homecoming game. I got my Sherlin on. Back then we had my big old Sherlin on, all black on black. And they come up like, yo, you came around here? Yo, you came up to my neighborhood looking for me? And I'm like, just having fun by myself at this point. Then I see another brother who was a friend of a family who actually started working there, who was still in his 20s. They saw how they surrounded me. And then another brother from my neighborhood, they all ran over there. And then they was like, yeah. And it was some words back and forth. And one of the brothers from around my neighborhood was like, nah, he cool, da. They didn't want that beef to happen with that particular neighborhood, the neighborhood I lived in. So when the people from my neighborhood came over there to kind of defend me, they said, oh, we'll squash this, we good, not for me, but just on GP, because, they wanted to squash the beef or what have you, and they had some words or what have you. But it could have went another way. And I just wanted to infuse that because, I've always been a good person. But that's how easy you can get wrapped up in some stuff and change the trajectory of your life. And that's why I have a lot of empathy. And did I even have to do that? Nah, I really didn't have to do that. But some part of you feel like you have to be protected, and people just don't understand that. And we then cast people out into being less than human. But my life could have been totally different if things didn't go that way. I could have been dead. I could have been in jail. Just from this one incident, it could have went various directions. But nonetheless, I wrote about some of these things when I got to college. She published the paper in the school. At some point in college, I was doing really good. I did really good in college. This is community college at this point. I took an interest in really learning. It was just different, you know? It was different. It was more fun. It was more applicable. It was more real. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to see something different. I applied for a computer science major initially. There were some hard classes, I'm not gonna lie. To me, the most difficult aspect of my college was at Baltimore City Community College. Then after there, at some point, I started doing business. I started actually installing cable and things like that. I started making money. My brother-in-law got me into it, my wife's brother, into doing cable as a subcontractor. I also did some things as a subcontractor, setting up things in the market and just doing different things. I also did carrier service. I started doing a lot of subcontracting jobs, and I realized you can make money, and I was making pretty good money. And then I started my own company, the company, a communications company, where I hired people or subcontracted to people to do work, and so on and so forth. Started a real estate company, and also started a truck rental company. And things just start popping from there. In my early 20s, I made more money than I ever thought that I could make. And it wasn't my goal to make that amount of money. But that also did something for me. Because initially I thought you had to be super duper smart to do all these things. Or I didn't realize that I was smart. One of the two. But one thing I realized, if I can apply myself, I can accomplish what I will. So what I think I honed in or nurtured was this thought that if I apply myself, I can be successful. So there's two things going at one time. I'm in school, and I'm also becoming an entrepreneur, and I'm in school. So at some point, I was so successful that I didn't really even know if I was going to finish school. Yeah, I didn't know why, because the average salary coming out of school wouldn't even match the amount of money that I was making. But nonetheless, things change. I did really well. Hired a lot of people. Lots and lots of people. Did good work. But there's a point where I got more into the culture. African-centered culture. And I started doing a lot more studying. Part of me, I started focusing on my studying probably to some degree more than I focused on entrepreneurship, because it was this new zeal in me. But also, the economy started to crash around that same time. This is about 2007, 8, 9. But I still was doing good because I started wholesaling houses, and I still had the truck rental business, and I still had a contracting company that was I was sizing down. But I was trying to get more into real estate, investing and things of that nature. Did really well. Was one of the, I want to say, especially when it pertains to wholesaling real estate, did really well. Probably one of the top wholesalers in Baltimore at that time. Really closing between 6 and 10 deals a month, averaging between $10,000 and $20,000 per deal. I had, so I had this business mindset. I was really good at business. I was really, really good at business. And at the same time, I'm reading now. I'm looking into my history that my father taught me. And I'm starting to really peak intellectually, about our story, about our culture, about our greats, about even looking at things of how this country has done us wrong. And all this just kind of happened at one time. I decided I would take a brocation where I would really put my efforts into my community. And the brocation piece would be a vacation from all that business stuff on an individual level, but really now do it more collectively. So my thoughts were that I've learned a lot from my early 20s to now almost 30 that would be very beneficial to my community, especially those of us who want to work collectively together. I start studying, I start looking at stuff on YouTube and listening to stuff it wasn't YouTube then, but just going on the internet, different radio shows, reading different books, going to different lectures and things like Tony Browder, Dr. Ray Hagins, just different people. I connect with Dr. Ray Hagins, who's a lecturer, and I go out and so I go to Egypt. I go to what some call Kemet. I go to Kemet with him. I take my father along with me because my father's always been very African-centered, and he wanted to go to Egypt as well. So we go there. I think that was about 2009, and I keep that relationship with Dr. Ray from going to Egypt. I'm also studying some of the things he puts out. At some point, I become a minister under the African Village and Culture Center, under Dr. Ray Hagins or what have you. I formed my own group here in Baltimore, alongside with my dear brother Marcus Sankofa Nix. So I'm not going to go into the details of everything, but I formed this group called the African Village and Culture Center, and in Baltimore. We're now known as TNET Holistic Wellness Center. We evolved to that. But nonetheless, Dr. Ray and other scholars and everything inspired me, so I went back to school again. Now at this time, the economy is not as good. I'm on my brocation. I decide I can't really work that much for just any old body. I've kind of been self-employed or independent or subcontracted in some kind of way. I'm skipping over a lot of things, but nonetheless, I said if I will work for somebody, I probably have to have more education because I just can't take any kind of job. And maybe I could have got all types of jobs, but I'm not a real good 9-to-5 person at this point. My whole life I've been kind of self-employed, and even though even if I did work with organizations, probably been some kind of subcontractor or some job with some free range. So I go back to school. At this time, I decided to go back to Sojourner Douglas College because I'm very African-centered at this time. And I'm like, well, I've always been African-centered, but I'm now doing it by myself. And I said, well, I'm gonna go to a black school. And what school better than Sojourner Douglas College, which is also an institution that was formed in the Black Power movement. Now, some of us would say, why would you go to Sojourner Douglas College? You should go to this college or that college. Why would you go to this black college that and many people have never heard of? But this school was very African-centered. It was very, it was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had intellectually. One of my professors and the provost, I had a class with her, and she had me do what they call a biological sketch. And her name is Dr. Marion Stanton. She's now an ancestor. And I did a biological sketch in her class because one of the things as being an entrepreneur what it allowed me to do is go to Sojourner Douglas College and get some credit for my real life experience or my real world experience. Because my degree, my bachelor's degree, is in business administration. So I've been doing business for a long time. So I think I did at least 20 something, maybe 30 credits of that with my prior real life experience or what have you. And what that allowed me to do is have a class with her with one more student in it in close proximity and several other classes. But this college to me was so phenomenal. Some of the textbooks that were used in the class would be the ISIS papers, pedagogy of the oppressed. They had classes such as psychology of the black family that everybody had to take part in. They had classes like psychology of racism that everybody who went to the school had to take part in. They had something called educational seminar, which used Paulo Freire's book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which also used Dr. Du Bois's book, Soul for Black Folks, and it also used The Miseducation of the Negro. So just think about that experience, right? And that to me was one of my most I'm going to say it was a very academic school at a bachelor's level, which also allowed me to apply my real life experience. Many people did not appreciate that school because the blackness about it, what have you. I really appreciated it, and it allowed me to grow. It challenged some of my dogmatic ways as it pertained to black people. And what I mean by that is that some of the, maybe I was a little more narrow than I would probably even thought I was as it pertained to, the argument against maybe a Du Bois or an argument with Du Bois and a Marcus Garvey or so on and so forth. It really expanded my thoughts on an academic level. I finished there magna cum laude, still working still have businesses full time, all that type of thing. It was a beautiful experience. It allowed me to grow. I don't think I could have grown going anywhere else like that. Now, then I decided the only reason why I went back to school is to become a clinician. And I also wanted to come back and teach. So I knew I had to get a Ph.D. But after I left Sojourner Douglas College, what I did was I went to Loyola University, which is the opposite of a Sojourner Douglas College. A college is very respected. It's a predominantly white institution. And I went to their clinical mental health counseling program. So I compared it against like other schools, HBCUs, predominantly white institutions, PWIs, Towson, and all these different schools, Hopkins, and so I liked their program because they also had this spiritual component as a part of their work. And not necessarily spiritual in the sense of religious, but spiritual. And it taught us how to use spirituality and psychology to aid our clients in making change. And really working with clients depending on their spiritual background. At this point, a minister at the African Village and Cultural Center. And I wanted to help the community because I realized that the community had issues that I really was not prepared for. I mean, I've read a lot of books, and really read a lot of books on the issues in our community, especially around trauma and oppression and the black condition or the human condition, but moreover, black people's plight in America and around the world of being oppressed by white supremacy, racism, whatever terms you want to use. I know people tend to prefer some terms over others, hegemony, these type of things. So I realized that I had to be prepared to deal with our condition. You know, this is after reading books, you know, being a minister. And really from my ministerial tenure is more African-centered, whereas I took an African-centered approach and looked at things from our lens, our culture, the oppression. But to some degree, it didn't always prepare us, or prepare me at least, and I would extend it to us, to really deal with some of these harsh realities. I recall one day a gentleman came into my office, and he spoke about his addiction issues, and I really didn't know what to do with that. And another thing that I always had a great fear of is, up until that point, was really, how do I deal with somebody who lost a loved one? And that was a great awkward, uneasy thing for me, especially as a minister. And but I knew that the time would come. I was also a little weirded or a little afraid, if I could say, to speak about people who may be dealing with suicidal issues. So I realized that all the books and all of that intellect that I gathered still did not prepare me to really deal with some of these real issues that take place in our community. So again, I went back to school because I wanted to advance in those areas. I never really went back to school to become a clinician. I went back to school to continue the work in the community that I started. And I think I failed to state why I started the African Village and Culture Center here in Baltimore. And that was because I had children and I had a place to go to called the Universal African Church, the Mayat Temple. And we didn't have anything like that. At that point in time when I was really starting to really get back into the culture on my own. You know, when I started reading and things like that, I wanted to have a place for my children, Dennis and Jamil. Going to Loyola, I kind of went in there thinking that to some degree I wasn't going to learn anything. I figured that, you know, my African-centered preparedness and the studies and things that I had done was to some degree enough. I did think I would learn some skills or what have you and all that type of thing. Maybe I'll learn a tool here and a tool there. But really what I learned most in Loyola is that things are a little bit more complex than we believe. What I learned becoming a counselor is that there's a lot, most stuff is in the gray. You know, we look for formulas and quick solutions and tools and all this stuff. We want certainty. We want all types of things. And what I learned is, in real life, that's just not a thing. You know, there's no quick answers to oppression. There's no quick answers to people who are dealing with depression. There's no quick solutions to people who are dealing with mental health disorders and addiction and death and loss and so on and so forth. And sometimes it's not about what you say, because sometimes we just want to fix things. And when we're dealing with people who have been hurt, sometimes it's just being there for them. I learned that you don't have to say something all the time, because there's nothing that you can say to really that's going to really fix that. And it's not about fixing that. It's about being there. And as I went through Loyola, I realized, because this was a spiritually based or psychology type of program, what I learned is a lot of the African-centered approach was right. It was in alignment with what I learned at Loyola, although this was a PWI. The program was itself kind of diverse, probably one of the most diverse programs at the school. And I also learned that there are white people out here that really will work with you. I also learned, because I mean, I'm in my my nationalist bag, but I'm like, you know, and I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with nationalism or being a black nationalist or anything like that. But sometimes I think it becomes so extreme that we do the opposite of what racism has done to us. And we begin to look at white folks and other folks as the enemy, every last one of them even. You know, it's kind of like it's taught. Although we logically say, well, maybe that's not the case, but emotionally and logically, there's two different things. You can logically say, well, you know, there are some good white people, but emotionally inside of you, when you're reading certain literature, it does something to you subconsciously to have you believe things that aren't necessarily true. And that's another thing I learned back in when I was going to college in general, that some of the things that we believe just are not true. You know, one of the things I said in my undergrad class is that black people don't own anything. And you hear people say it all the time. Black people don't own anything. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. And then my professor said, don't you own 3 businesses? And so some of the extremes or extremism or looking at things from an extreme perspective, when you go to certain levels of education, you begin to challenge those things that you once believed and held on. And that's one of the greatest things I've experienced in academia in general, but even more so having gone to this now PWI, where before I went there, they said they don't talk about oppression and racism and all these things. But I was surprised that literally they use the term white supremacy. Before then, I thought white supremacy was a term, or racism, or especially like white supremacy and those type of terms. I thought these were just terms that we as African Americans use to describe our plight. But these terms were actually in textbooks. You know, I had a class, a lot of people don't like the term multicultural development, but I will say that I took a class on multicultural development and multiculturalism per se. That was a phenomenal class with one of my professors, who was a white lady. When I was in the class, I shared with her that I thought she did a good job, and she said, oh, why do you say that? You saying that because I'm a white lady? And I thought that was funny. You know, I said, no, because you did a really good job. And I realized to some degree she experienced difference as well. She experienced being a part of a different type of Christian religion that is not totally accepted, that allow her to tap in. You know, she did a lot of work in Haiti, and I'm saying from my point of view, she did some really good work in Haiti after the hurricanes and things that took place there, and some things in Katrina. But before then, you know, in my mind, all white people are going down there and they're taking advantage of our people. Now, there's some truth that some of that is going on, but the reality is not everybody's doing that. You know, some of us will look at even our condition in America, and we block out the many Europeans or white people that actually assisted. But it's like we can understand that, but then we default back to, but they're doing that for a reason. Or, you know, John Brown, he helped, but he did that because for some reason, for himself, and so on and so forth. And so it's kind of like a place that we find ourselves. And Dr. Joy DeGruy, and her book is here, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. But one of the symptoms that she speak about was, she said one of the main features of post-traumatic slave syndrome is that the belief system is distorted. And the belief system being distorted is a feature that is consistent with being traumatized in general. It's not necessarily just post-traumatic slave syndrome or race-based trauma that the belief system is kind of thwarted. It's across the board, because what happens is when you've been oppressed, or let me further that by saying traumatized, we begin to believe that we have a hyper state, or we're hyper alert. I can't think of a better term at the moment. we're hyper alert. So we begin to look for threat. And that which reminded us of past threat, we are hyper alert. So if we see, let's say, a person who was maybe raped by someone, let's say the person was a man who raped a woman, it's likely, not all people, but it's likely that this person may feel very uncomfortable or triggered as or activated or hyper aroused when they are or she is around men who remind her of the person who raped her. Likewise, I say in African American community, even if we have not experienced slavery, even if we have not experienced slavery directly, it's been passed down through epigenetic, the way we've been reared, through the stories and the narratives that we've been told, have been, all these type of things. It's passed down many different ways by our behaviors, how our parents respond to us. But nonetheless, we have a narrative of slavery. We have a narrative of oppression that is real. We have a narrative of the traumas that happened to black people back then and still today. Even when we turn on the media, some of us do not realize how looking at these murders and these killings of black women and men by police officers. Even just recently, a young brother, I think he's not even 30, was just murdered by like 5 police officers, if I'm counting correctly, and they were all black. But even to us, those black guys represent the institution, and they also represent whiteness. So that has us looking at now all police, because the trauma is real. Now the reality is now anybody who wears that uniform is now seen as an enemy. And I think for good reason, because we have to protect ourselves. But is that really true? It's not really true. I have people in my family who serve this office. I'm pretty sure many of us know people who serve these offices. But when we've been traumatized, it's hard to distinguish between that which is not a threat and that which is a threat. And we tend to overestimate threat. And we do that because it's important for us to protect ourselves. And so that happens with whiteness even. That happens when we see white people. That happens when we see people from other ethnic groups. That happens with just looking at the media. There's everything in this country and is seen as a threat. And to some degree, this is not a crazy place to be. It's because you have to protect yourself, because these mediums have been used to oppress you, to manipulate you, to exploit you, to abuse you, and it's also been used to support why you're doing that, why you're not worthy. These mediums or media are used to keep you to a great degree in this hyper alert state, hyper aroused state. So I think we have to be really careful what we ingest in our psyches, our hearts, our souls, our spirits. So going to Loyola, it allowed me to expand in my thinking, challenge some of my thoughts, challenge some of what I thought was reality. It really helped me see the world with a wider lens. Sojourner Douglas College set me up for that. Then I graduated from Loyola. I did really well at Loyola, really, really well. I wrote a paper on African Senate. My capstone paper was around my theory of mind, which was very African Senate. I then decided to pursue a PhD. In this PhD program, which was a very powerful program as well, I actually went to 2 schools because I had some issues at one with them actually closing down. So nonetheless, I went to this school who accepted my credits, which was I really appreciate them doing so, and I really appreciate the rigor of the program and the instruction at Waynesburg University.
I believe that God set forth the path and knew that I and we would get exactly what we've needed for our journeys forward.
University.
No.
And I completed the remainder of my coursework, my internship. I TA'd, was a teacher assistant by way of Waynesburg University. I TA'd at Johns Hopkins University, their clinical mental health counseling program. So I had a lot of experience. I also did advanced clinical training there and clinical supervision training and some other advanced skills and research and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, my dissertation topic at Waynesburg University was measuring the relationship of race-based trauma, Black identity, and spirituality. And I've been doing this research for some time. You know, I've been reading books. Even the studying I was doing in my ministry was adjacent with what I was doing in school for all these years. Because one of my mentors, Dr. Henry Gregory, suggested when I started my master's program to continue to write around the same topic. And I just wrote about Black people. I studied and researched the Black family. I researched Black individual counseling. I just did a lot of research on it. So in line with that, my dissertation topic was measuring the relationship of race-based trauma, Black identity, and spirituality, as I mentioned earlier. And I wrote a lot of pages on that dissertation topic. I read the books, I did a lot of work. And then when it was time for me to actually write my literature review, I came across some new literature. And this literature was from Robert, what is his name? Robert Carter, I think his name is, and another gentleman named Paterse. And this is Measuring Race-Based Trauma. That was one great book that added to my works, but nonetheless, he also had a scale that could measure race-based trauma, which actually helped me pull together my research study, which was a quantitative-based study, a lot easier. However, I had to do a lot more reading. So I put my dissertation off at least a year. So I did a lot of readings, research, and studying. So trauma in the Black family, trauma in the Black community. You know, throughout this conversation, I've been speaking about the Black community and my own experience in the Black community, and a lot of what I spoke about is directly correlated with racism. So a lot of the time, the things, the ills that we see, the plights that we see in the Black community have a lot to do with oppression, racism. As Dr. Francis Cress Welsing talks about, as Dr. Neely Fuller speaks about, his book is here, United Independent Compensatory Code System and Concept. And Dr. Wells's book, The ISIS Papers, as you see here, it speaks about, they speak to racism being systemic, racism being pervasive in every aspect of life, entertainment, business, economics, all just, in other words, it's inseparable, that is intertwined in this very culture. And so it's a it's a very complex thing, racism. See, some people think racism and they confuse it with discrimination or one being having prejudices. We all discriminate. We all have prejudice. And to some degree, we need those things. We have to discriminate. It helps us make decisions. They keep us safe. But the thing about race, and at this point, I think many of us know it's a construct, not a reality. It's not a biological reality. I mean, you can say, well, skin type, there's some variations of skin type, hue, and all that type of thing, melanin levels and type of melanin and all that type of thing. But the reality is, when we look at race was concocted, constructed as something to differentiate people. Race was concocted to say that these people were greater than these people. It was race is pseudo scientific. Now we've kind of evolved race to be a little different and even be proud of race. But the reality is, because race was, the idea of race in of itself was racist. Race was built on, again, black people being at the lower end of that caste, white people being at the upper end of that caste. Hence, black people being more inferior than white people. And then everybody else kind of fell in between depending on their hue. Now, the interesting thing about race is that I have people in my family that are lighter than some white people, but they're also considered to be black. Then there's darker skinned white people, but they're not considered to be any different, but nonetheless, people they differ as it pertains to different hues, but hue enough is not enough to designate one as being black or white, because it's a construct. Genetically, some of us are considered black, but we look more phenotypically white, or closer or lighter. And then some of us are genetically considered white, but have some African ancestry. So race is not necessarily a reality. Many of us know this. It's a construct, like many things. So it's difficult to erase it, and some would argue whether it should be or should not be. I think it's just almost impossible. Maybe, because we hold on to it because we've been oppressed and discriminated, and then sometimes some people want us to overlook this and not. I think much of what we're holding on to now that I'm thinking about this as I talk is that if you remove this concept of race, you also erase the treatment of our people. So when I think about this now, it's not so much that we are holding on to race as an idea, more that there's been something done to us and others. Some, we're black and we're proud. We hold on to it like that as well. But the reality is, if we take race away, it almost says that we're all equal, when we know that there's major discrimination. Much of what I talked about earlier, growing up, a lot of this has to do with being black in America, and it stems back to our experience here in these lands, the oppression that we experienced, the enslavement that we've experienced, the outright brutality that we experience at the hands of those who are identified as white. Now, the interesting thing about race is sometimes I think it clouds our mind. It has pros and cons. Just personally, I don't think it's going anywhere, although it's a construct. I think it has utility, but I think sometimes we utilize it to a degree where it's unhealthy. We believe it means, and it has greater meaning than it truly has in some cases. So when we look at trauma in the black community and the family, what does that look like? What does that look like? It looks like what I said earlier, black men selling drugs to each other. Now we understand the idea that that white people sell drugs and use drugs is equal or more. You understand? But the reality is the way that we do that, the conditions you see us in, and even white people. Let's keep it 100. Let's keep it a buck. Though there have been oppressed groups of white people. See, race makes you believe that everybody white is somehow wealthy and everybody black is somehow poor. Now, intellectually, we understand that that's not true, but most of the time when we're talking about issues of race, we're not really thinking from an intellectual position. We're thinking about it from an emotional position. So although I can say this white man across the street has may not be as wealthy, maybe I might have more financial means or what have you, but somewhere viscerally or subconsciously we see white people as wealthy, we see black people as oppressed, we see black people as slaves, we see white people as enslavers, and we don't really look at the nuance. We don't look at the complexity of historically what has taken place. But nonetheless, generally, well, let me just challenge that a little bit. I just don't want us to look at black people as just slaves. In fact, some would say call them prisoners of war, and I agree with that, or enslaved. And because slave is almost like a title. It's almost like a status. It's almost like, but not just a status. It's almost like you've been destined to be a slave when you call someone a slave. No one's born a slave. People are enslaved. And when we see this form of chattel slavery that took place in the United States, we really have to examine the extent of it and the brutality that took place. And we have to examine not just the physical brutality, but I think it's really important that we understand that psychologically it has done something to those who experienced it. And generationally, not being able to heal from that, we pass that down to our future generations. And that it has been passed down to us. Dr. Joy DeGruy speaks about it in her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And I think that's definitely something that we must examine. Now, the thing about that is, it's not that it just stopped there. It continued. It continues today. Even though we're not, quote unquote, enslaved, as experiencing chattel slavery, historically, that has been passed on to us. But also, we still experience forms of oppression today that remind us of what happened yesterday that we're triggered by. We're constantly bombarded by the media. And I am not convinced that the media doesn't understand how what they put out there triggers and keeps us in hyper states of arousal. Not all of us. And I think that's something else, but many of us. I think it's important for us to understand and be able to measure, as I did in my research, what does it do to us? On a surface level, it looks like the neighborhoods you drive through, many of the neighborhoods we see in Baltimore, the treatment, the devastation of our intimate relationships. It looks like violence, drugs. It looks like materialistic culture. Because naturally, and I guess I'll say naturally, but traditionally, Black African people were not as materialistic. And even if it was some form of material, it still has some greater significance. Now material has no greater meaning but to for most of us, but to fill in a box of void, to try to, that we're attempting to close a gap inside of us to feel like we are enough, that we are important, that we are on equal playing field as white people or the oppressors, or some will call even their children. I think that's pretty important. We spoke about some of the ills, you know, and the ills are infinite. We see lots of times, we see molestation, child abuse, we see addiction. We see that these things are pervasive. We see certain types of disciplining behaviors. We see all types of things, you know, even as Dr. Joy DeGruy speaks about 3, she speaks about symptoms, and some of the symptoms she speaks about is ever-present anger, racist socialization, and vacant esteem. And when she speaks about this vacant esteem, she's saying that it's below self-esteem. It's like Black people tend to lots of times express a high level of confidence, but she says different than esteem, and I agree, because some of the research shows that Black people are very confident, and many times more confident than their European or white counterparts. And then there's this racist socialization when we're being reared to not really appreciate our Blackness, you know, our Blackness. We'll do anything, but we'll almost do anything to avoid being considered Black. Some of us will say things like, I have Indian in my family. There's Indian in my family. And the truth is, some of us do, but not nearly as much as many of us suggest. But there's some arguments around that, and I'm not really trying to go there because I think I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with the level of research in that area, if they have enough samples. But then there's this ever-present anger that Dr. Joy DeGruy speaks about, that we carry around. She said it seems like we can be having a good time, and then out of nowhere, someone blows up. Because one of the things, especially even in her research and lots of research, is this level of not feeling respected. So we demand respect, and at the sign of any sign of what we perceive as disrespect at times can really be a very troubling event, because we can go from looking like we're having a good time to blowing up, or what some would say going from 1 to 100. But the reality is we're very sensitive when it comes to needing to be respected. And that happens when you feel oppressed, or when the world tells you you're less than. When you're not really less than, we're really phenomenal people. But that's a symptom that DeGruy and others speak about. I mean, most of us see it in our brothers who are out in the street demanding respect. Because when you feel that you're not respected, you can become sensitive in that area. So then, in my own research, I use the RBTSSS, that's race-based traumatic stress symptom scale, to really look at the various symptoms on a psychological, physiological, from a psychological, physiological perspective. Let me grab my computer. I have a little bit. Maybe I can be a little clear on some of the symptoms here that the RBTSS measures. And so it measures depression, intrusive symptoms, anger, hypervigilance, physical arousal levels, low self-esteem, avoidance symptoms. And it's important because we can measure the impact that racism has on us. We can measure it. And in my study, which I looked at black people, because what is this idea of being black? And this is another symptom that I find to be a part of the condition, is that we fight and argue about what is the best way to be black. You know, we call each other sellouts and this and that, all types of things. If you're not with my program, then you are not really black. You know, and I have to be honest, you know, what that just triggered in me is the President of the United States made a comment, if I recall, he said something around, if you vote for that other guy, the other president, what did he say? I'm going to take your black card, or you're not black enough. Like, what in any white man's right mind makes him believe that he, like, wow, that's just being disrespectful. You can't take somebody's black card, Mr. President or Biden. That's just, to me, that is a level of what the term that people are using, privilege. To me, I call it ignorance. I mean, as an academic, I get it, but I see various aspects of privilege or how we identify. I say this ignorance. I just don't know. I don't know any better. You know, I just don't know. So sometimes privilege to me makes it sound more positive than what it truly is, but it's ignorance. So when we look at these symptoms, anger and physiological symptoms, self-esteem symptoms, all these type of things. I compared it against people from different religious and socio-political backgrounds. And one key thing that I found, that it didn't really matter what a person's religious ideology or background was, whether they were religious or not. It didn't really have an impact on one's the amount of symptoms one had as it pertained to race-based trauma. A lot of us will fight and say this is the best one for us and that is the best one for us and this is the best way in my religion, you know, and we really think that if you do not have this particular religious perspective, or some would say if you have a religious perspective, that somehow you have more trauma as it pertains to being a black man or a black woman. But so far, I don't think the research supports that. And then two, just your social ideology, your political ideology. The research might be disappointing for some. So when we look at political ideology or social frameworks, I use the Cross Black Identity Scale. In that Black Identity Scale, it measures different attitudes relating to being black. Black identity is just how you relate to being black in layman's terms. You know, how I show up, what I believe being black is, and what is important. So you have people who identify as assimilationists. And lots of times, you know, assimilationists are those that would say, I'm just an American. I don't deal with that race stuff. You know, I'm just an American. I don't do all that. Then you have those who are who identify as multiculturalists. And they pretty much, these group of people really have a comfortability in being black, but also okay with, expanding out to other racial groups and still being black at the same time. Whereas on the other hand, those who have a higher level of Afrocentricity or African-centered disposition, they are more culturally involved and so on and so forth. I named these three. These three are considered achieved identities. And let me say that again. So assimilationists, then Afrocentrists, and then multiculturalists. And I probably should have said Afrocentrists before I say multiculturalists, because it is thought that one who's African-centered can, at some point develop to be more multicultural, but nonetheless. And it's also important to understand that you can have, this is not a linear type of scale. You can fall within all three of these to some degree, right? But you might be higher on one. One might be more dominant for you. But then there's I believe, three other categories: miseducation, another is self-hate, and then the third would be anti-white sentiments. And these three identities are looked at non-achieved or non-achieved identities, or identities or barriers to achieving an achieved identity. Now, when we look at these identities, what my research supported is those with higher anti-white sentiments and those with self-hate, those who score high on self-hate and anti-white sentiments. Anti-white sentiments basically means that I have a level of I'm aroused easily, angered easily about anything that represents to me or is symbolic of whiteness. So I see a white guy, I'm aroused. I go into white communities, I'm aroused. Anything that symbolizes whiteness may be more likely to impact this person. And the interesting thing, we have ideologies out here that teach this, and it can help aid in this level of arousal, which I would probably argue is not that healthy. Then you have self-hate. And self-hate is when you see blackness as being inferior. You see maybe your physical traits as being inferior. You may wish that you were not black. You may feel like you were cursed into blackness or what have you. So this self-hate, you might think that your group is inferior. And these showed up to really predict most of the race-based traumatic stress symptoms. So I think this is an area that we should look at, and how we develop our identities. There was no significant difference between one who is considered multiculturalist, Afrocentrist, or assimilationist. So, and I know that for many of us, we will believe that assimilationist and having self-hate is the same thing. But I think it's important that we tease this out, because it's not necessarily the same thing. But one who is an assimilationist can also have high levels of self-hate. So I think race is a very complex situation. But I'll be remiss if I don't share that some of our African-centered scholars, such as Dr. Naeem Akbar, Asa G. Hilliard, Dr. Wade Nobles, and so on, predicted in some of their theoretical papers that, in their conceptualizations and things, that spirituality can serve as a buffer, or serve and has aided in reducing or allowing us to really maintain, adapt, cope to this level of oppression that we experience. And my research supports that that spirituality, specifically prayer fulfillment and fulfillment from meditative practices, serve to buffer some of the symptomology as it pertains to race-based traumatic stress. So I think this stuff is very interesting, very complex, but nonetheless, I think it's very important. And my fight is really looking at what is helping us and separating that from what is hindering us. And many times, as Dr. Joy DeGruy speaks about and just which is general in trauma, is that our belief system tends to keep us in patterns that harm us. Our belief system tends to keep us in patterns that harm us. So I'll give you an example, just a little different from race, is that one who has been the one who has been traumatized is more likely to be traumatized again. Because what happens is it changes your worldview, or it creates a worldview for you. And it creates a worldview of, I can't trust, I'm hyper aroused, I have all sorts of behaviors that put me in position to likely be hurt again. Many may have heard of someone who's been raped. And then you say, she was raped and she got raped again. And some would say, why she keep getting raped? She's, is this the truth? Or they'll question whether she's putting herself in position, or, all these type of things. But the reality is the person is not trying to put themselves in position to be hurt again. It's just when you haven't really healed from trauma, we try to avoid trauma, but paradoxically it creates an atmosphere, or it puts us in atmospheres that will likely hurt us again. And that's what happens with us. And this is my thought. Because our belief system is off, if we say we've been traumatized, we really have to learn to deal with it. Many times we say we have been enslaved and we never got the treatment that we needed. And many of us who say that, we still don't go and get the treatment. And typically that's because, again, because of our oppression, we do not trust the health system. We don't trust black therapists. We don't trust black doctors. We don't trust doctors at all, many of us. And I understand where that comes from. And it makes a lot of sense. But what happens with trauma, we discount the positives many times. And we look for the negative. We look for the threat. But we don't look for, so we have examples of how things have hurt us, but often we'll overlook how things have helped us. We'll look at those people who have hurt us, and then we'll generalize that across groups of people easier than we'll say, well, you know what? It wasn't all of those men who did that. It wasn't all of those women who did that. Not every man has raped me. Not every woman has abandoned me. Likely, not all and everything in America has traumatized us. We have had some assistance to help in our fight. So me, it's not about not looking back and seeing how we were hurt. It's not about focusing on that. it's not about not focusing on that. I think on one hand, we ought to realize what happened to us and really take that into account, but simultaneously look at what has helped us rise to where we are now. And I know many of us feel like we haven't risen. To me, that's another symptom of trauma, because we would rather say we haven't done anything when we have fought many good fights. So I think it's, again, important to deal with that trauma. And I love to have conversations, dialogue, feedback in the future. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your feedback. If you have any, I'm Dennis Ausar Winkler, and I'm signing out. Until next time, peace and power.